One of the more important aspects of a game like No Man's Sky is its inventory mechanic within the game. And a very central pillar of a game like No Man's Sky has you collecting all kinds of items, but that's not just the only important piece, it's also how you store and manage these things. In today's video, I'm going to cover three important topics. First off, inventory issues raised by the community and things that I agree are actually issues. I'm going to re-emphasize my angle on a loot mechanic and how I think an already existing mechanic within No Man's Sky can really be beefed up to focus on a loot-centric type system without exactly becoming a looter-shooter of sorts. And then lastly, how do we fix and improve the inventory of No Man's Sky to make it an all-around better experience for everyone? But before we get started, I want to sincerely say thank you to the 4,000 subscribers that have joined the LZ and hanging out until we see Beyond finally launch, whenever the hell that's going to be. So absolutely honored to have you here. So why don't we go ahead and dive into this topic head first. First off, let's talk about potential issues and issues that the community have already raised about inventory in No Man's Sky. First things first, things for the inventory mechanic are a bit convoluted. There's at least 4 types of inventories to manage. You have your suit, you have your suit's auxiliary, which sort of arbitrarily holds more items. You have your ship inventory, and then you have inventories through large crates that you build in bases or on freighters. Not to mention a 5th type of inventory that is your actual freighter. And out of these 5 types, none of them are very well connected, with the exception of maybe your suit and your ship, depending on how close by you are to your ship, which I guess is an okay mechanic. It definitely makes sense. But one of the biggest issues that No Man's Sky's inventory mechanic has is that it fails to have solutions for problems that it created for itself. Instead of having a perfectly coherent inventory system that you can manage a singular, at least suit inventory, things like stacking were added, which I guess is fine, but then you have the need for an auxiliary suit inventory that holds more items, which doesn't really do the central idea of the inventory very much justice at all. It just sort of tacks on a solution to a greater problem that the inventory mechanic isn't very well realized to begin with. And speaking of another half measure, tech inventory slots for parts and upgrades for both your suit and your ship, that's really just a half measure in my opinion. And I think really it's actually a good idea sort of as a foundation for a better idea, but I think they should really take a concept like the tech inventory slots for especially your ship to really make for a better inventory system. I'll actually cover that deeper in the solutions part of the video, so hang out for that. Another thing, there's very little reason and incentive for item hoarders like myself and other folks that I've seen on Twitter talking about this. There's just not that much push for them to store precious and rare items. A lot of the items and materials and resources are, very few of them have a level of importance that bears keeping them, right? And I often find myself in the greater storages sort of looking through them going, why am I even holding these? Am I going to use these at some point? Of course they're full because I'm an absolute storageaholic, but the game doesn't do a very good job of putting emphasis on importance of some of those items. Most of them are for either crafting something, refueling something, or just selling it for money. When I did my No Man's Sky 2.0 video, I was talking about things like shipbuilding, for instance, and it's sort of a 50-50 response on whether people support that kind of idea. A lot of folks said that they don't really support shipbuilding because they feel that it would take away from the RNG finding of ships, and I holistically, completely disagree with that. The RNG of finding ships could absolutely stay, but in my solutions to fixing inventories and things like that, and I digress a little bit, but to my greater point, there could be more emphasis and importance on an item-to-item basis to make those items a little more worthwhile, a little more worth keeping, a little more worth storing. Having a gigantic library of item and resources that are just good for maybe crafting something unimportant or selling just kind of takes away my drive to want to do it. Another thing is incoherent upgrade design with little exploration and understanding. Things like upgrade bonuses actively kind of harm the inventory experience, in my opinion. Think of something like a hyperdrive upgrade, for instance, right? If you find a ship that you really like, it's got decent stats, but the hyperdrive or the main hyperdrive part of the ship is sort of sectioned off on its whole island, it's still not super explained what kind of benefits you do and don't get, maybe aside from a little bit of an extra buff to your hyperdrive when you place upgrades. You can absolutely place upgrades, but you probably won't get that buff. I'll talk about this more in my solutions part of the video towards the end, but needless to say, I think this is sort of a burden on the inventory system as a whole. And I think something like this ought to come with more of an RPG-like mechanic that tells you more clearly what kind of upgrades and changes will be made to your upgrades and your parts, whether it be on your suit or your ship, versus not following such an arbitrary process. Perhaps upgrades may be another video for down the road. And then lastly, a lack of unified storage aside from your suit and ship makes things confusing and a chore to manage. And I'm particularly highlighting the giant storage units that you would put on your base or in your ship, your freighter, and knowing that those each individual box only holds just a handful of items, having those boxes sort of be separate and really the only way of differentiating between the two is perhaps color coding. I'd like more of a unified system for at least those particular types of storage so that maybe if I set those crates next to each other, they become one unified list of items that you have stored in them versus having to visit them separately. So now that we've talked about the issues, before I get to the solutions, I really want to re-emphasize, I did a video a little bit ago talking about loot in No Man's Sky and how the mechanic is already kind of there in concept, but the execution of it really just doesn't have the carrot at the end of the stick, right? You have a lot of games these days that have a loot mechanic, some games really centrally focusing on that loot mechanic. No Man's Sky already has a good foundation in place, right? It has letter ratings, color codings, things like that. It's just not really utilizing finding these items in a satisfying manner and things like that. So I encourage you to go watch that video too. Check out the card above to view that video. But now I want to get into the solutions, how to fix or improve the inventory in No Man's Sky. Firstly, I'm just going to come right out and say it. Suit and ship parts and upgrades should not be part of the inventory at all. They should absolutely be their own separate system entirely. I'm going to show a couple of pics here of some mock-ups that I did of a user interface that kind of highlights this in a little bit. But suit and ship parts and upgrades should be their own system separately, right? Inventory should be its own thing. It makes absolutely no sense to me. It's very nonsensical that parts to a ship or a suit occupy the inventory space, right? The whole concept, I see what they were trying to go for, but the execution, not only is it not sensical to me, but it just doesn't, it just doesn't work. I think there are absolutely better ways to do this. There have been games that have done this better. And a good thing about this, for like, say for suits examples, right? That if you take out suit parts like your jetpack, your environmentals, things like Atlas passes, for God's sake. If you just removed the actual parts and upgrades to those parts from your suit and separated them in their own section, I think by itself that would enhance the inventory mechanic all by itself without having to do much else. But if you were to use the sort of right arrow on your controller, you would go over to a section that might have a small set of squares for just your jetpack, for instance, or a set of small, like 4 or 5 squares, depending on what your suit is like, to upgrade just your shields, for instance. You could have a small section of 2 or 3 boxes for how fast you can run or how long you can sprint. Those two mechanics, your parts and your upgrades separated from the inventory, has a whole lot of imagination on how you can handle those things, which also means that you probably wouldn't need a secondary inventory on your person either at that point. Of course, you can still have things like stacking, and I mean that's already a brilliant example of doing it right, so I wouldn't really change stacking either. Also, I'd love better and more creative ways to manage other inventories that you can't easily get access to right away. Like, say for instance, you're on a planet, your freighter is up in the upper atmosphere, there's something on your freighter that you really want, but you don't want to have to be bothered to get in your ship and fly up there. It'd be really cool to sort of place an order to your freighter to have them launch particular resources down to you, sort of like a orbital drop shock trooper from Halo or something, right? It just sort of launches it in a pod and then you can go and retrieve your resources that you wanted from it. Not only is that easier, but I just think that's just more badass if you ask me. But No Man's Sky's inventory and item collection are a central pillar to the experience of the game, and while its current systems are obviously serviceable, I can see a lot of opportunity here to make this pillar of the game truly shine. Folks, if you liked today's video and if it was rewarding to your No Man's Sky viewing experience, like and subscribe and maybe even hit the bell to get further notifications of our videos coming up while we wait for Beyond to launch. And comment below, what are your thoughts on No Man's Sky's inventory mechanics and how would you improve these systems? And as always, the LZ needs your help, so consider supporting monetarily by hitting join or picking up some merch. I got some pretty awesome t-shirts down there already, but I've got some new badass shirts on the way that I think you're gonna like. But otherwise, always great to have you in the LZ. Thank you for stopping by, and see you again later.